The boy stood in the doorway of the boathouse with a rusted oarlock gripped in both hands like a weapon, and he did not lower it, even though the man in front of him was 3 times his size and soaked through from the same storm that had nearly killed them all. Behind him, 2 smaller children pressed themselves into the shadows between a coiled rope and an overturned dinghy, and the boy did not look back at them, not once, because looking back would have meant taking his eyes off the threat in front of him. "We're not going anywhere," he said, and his voice cracked in the middle of it, but he didn't stop. "You can put us out in the storm if you want. We'll take our chances with the sea before we go to any orphan house." Nathaniel Cole, who had spent 15 years learning how to feel nothing at all, felt something move in his chest that he had no name for anymore. If a story like this one has ever stopped you scrolling and actually felt something, stay until the end, because this one earns it. Subscribe if stories about second chances and the families we choose mean something to you, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I want to know how far a story like this can travel. The autumn of 1891 had been a hard one on the coast of Maine, and the town of Saltmarsh Point knew hard autumns the way old sailors know hard weather, which is to say they didn't flinch from it, they simply endured it and waited for spring. Nathaniel Cole had kept the light at Saltmarsh Point for 15 years, and in all that time he had missed exactly 2 nights of lighting the lamp, both of them the week his wife Margaret died, along with the daughter she'd been carrying, in a fever that took them both within 4 days of each other, and left him standing in an empty house with nothing left to keep except a light that had to be lit every single night, whether he wanted to live or not. He was 46 years old that autumn, broad through the shoulders the way men get who climb 112 spiral stairs twice a day for a decade and a half, with hands cracked and yellowed from oil and rope, and a face that had settled somewhere around year 3 of his grief into an expression that didn't change much regardless of what was happening in front of him. The town knew him as a careful man, a reliable man, a man who kept the light burning and answered direct questions in as few words as the question allowed, and otherwise kept to himself on the rock where the lighthouse stood, a half-mile out from the harbor on a causeway that flooded twice a day with the tide. He did not attend the church socials, he did not sit on the harbor wall in the evenings the way the old captains did, telling stories and arguing about weather. He rode in for supplies once a week, exchanged the minimum words required, and rode back out. It was a small life, deliberately small, built to the precise dimensions of a man who had decided that wanting things was a door that led nowhere good. Then came the storm that the old-timers would talk about for the next 30 years, the one that took the merchant ship Annesley Rose 2 miles off the point in the dark, with 31 souls aboard, most of them families crossing from Ireland, with everything they owned packed into trunks below deck, chasing the particular kind of hope that only shows up in people who have nothing left to lose. Nathaniel had kept the light burning through the worst of it, had stood at the top of the tower watching the black water churn white against the rocks, had seen, or thought he saw, through sheets of rain, the shape of the ship breaking against the outer reef, and had known, with the flat certainty of a man who had watched the sea take things before, that there was nothing he could do about it from where he stood. The light was the only mercy he had to offer, and he kept it burning all night. And in the morning, when the storm finally exhausted itself, he rowed the half-mile to shore to see what the sea had given back. What it gave back, mostly, was wreckage and grief. 11 survivors pulled from the wreck or washed ashore clinging to broken timber, and 20 who never surfaced at all. Among the survivors were 3 children, found 2 days after the wreck, not by the search parties combing the beach, but by Nathaniel himself, hiding in his own boathouse on the causeway, where they had apparently crawled in the dark and the chaos and simply stayed, too frightened to come out, surviving on a sack of dried apples and a wheel of cheese they'd found on a shelf, and rationed between themselves with a discipline that broke something loose in Nathaniel's chest the moment he understood what he was looking at. The oldest was a boy of 11 named Oliver, lean and dark-haired, with eyes that had clearly seen things no 11-year-old should have to carry. And it was Oliver who stood between Nathaniel and his sisters that first morning, with the oarlock raised, refusing to be moved, refusing to let his sisters be moved, holding a position that no reasonable person would have expected an 11-year-old to hold against a grown man twice his size. Behind him were Charlotte, 8 years old, with her brother's same dark watchfulness, and Daisy, barely 4, who clung to her sister's skirt and stared at Nathaniel with the wide, unguarded curiosity that only the very young can afford in moments when everyone else has learned to be afraid. "I'm not here to put you anywhere," Nathaniel said, and his own voice sounded strange to him, rusted from disuse in this particular register, the register of speaking gently to frightened children, which he had not done in 15 years and had not expected to do again. "I keep the light here. This is my boathouse you're standing in." Oliver did not lower the oarlock. "They take children like us to the asylum in Portland," he said. "We heard the men on the beach talking about it. They split families up there, send the boys to farms and the girls into service, and you never see your own blood again. I won't let that happen to my sisters. I don't care what I have to do." Nathaniel looked at this small, soaked, starving boy holding a rusted piece of iron between his family and the world, and he thought of every reason he had built his entire life around not feeling anything. And he found in that moment, standing in his own boathouse in the gray morning light, that none of those reasons were strong enough to hold against what he was looking at. He lowered himself slowly to one knee, which put him below the boy's eye level rather than above it, a small thing, but the kind of small thing that mattered to a child who had spent 2 days believing that every grown man who found them was a threat. "Nobody is taking your sisters anywhere," Nathaniel said, "not while there's breath in me to stop it. But you can't stay in a boathouse eating cheese rinds. You're going to come up to the house, all 3 of you, and you're going to eat something hot, and then we're going to figure out the rest of it together. That's all I'm asking right now, just breakfast." Oliver studied him for a long moment, the kind of measuring look that Nathaniel recognized because he had given that exact look to strangers. Himself for 15 years. And then, slowly, the boy lowered the oarlock to his side, though he did not let go of it. What followed were weeks that Nathaniel would later struggle to describe to anyone, because there was no single dramatic moment in them, only an accumulation of small ones that added up to something enormous before he had noticed it happening. He learned their story in pieces, the way children tell the truth, sideways and out of order, and only when they trust the silence around them enough to fill it. Their parents, Michael and Bridget Doyle, had sold everything they owned in County Clare to buy passage to America, chasing a letter from a cousin in Boston who promised work and land and a life that Ireland, in the grip of another hard year, could no longer offer them. Both parents had drowned in the wreck. There was no cousin's address that survived the crossing, no letter, nothing but 3 children and the clothes they'd been wearing when the ship went down. Nathaniel fed them. He gave them the 2 empty bedrooms in the Lighthouse keeper's cottage, rooms that had sat closed and dust-sheeted since Margaret died, and he found, with some private astonishment, that opening those doors again did not feel like the violation of memory he had always assumed it would. He taught Oliver how to trim the lamp wick and check the oil levels, work the boy took to with a fierce, focused gratitude that Nathaniel understood better than he could have explained, because he recognized in it the particular relief of a person who has been given something useful to do with grief.
Charlotte, it turned out, had a memory for numbers that put the harbor merchants to shame, and within a month she was keeping Nathaniel's supply ledger more accurately than he ever had himself. Daisy simply attached herself to Nathaniel, the way small children do when they have decided with the swift and absolute logic of the very young that a person is safe. And she followed him up and down the spiral stairs of the lighthouse with a determination that made him slow his pace without ever once asking himself why.
It was Daisy, in fact, who broke something open in him completely on an evening about 6 weeks after the wreck, when she fell asleep against his side on the bottom step of the tower while he was telling her, for no reason he could name except that she had asked, the story of how the light worked, how the lamp turned, how ships a dozen miles out could see it and know where the rocks were and steer clear of them in the dark. She had fallen asleep mid-sentence, the particular sudden collapse of a 4-year-old who simply runs out of awake all at once. And Nathaniel had sat there on the cold stone step with her weight warm against his ribs and felt, for the first time in 15 years, something other than the careful management of an old wound. He felt, simply, that he did not want to move, that he would have sat on that step all night rather than disturb what was happening in his chest. But Saltmarsh Point was a small town, and small towns notice everything, and it was not long before word reached the county that the lighthouse keeper at the point had taken in 3 shipwrecked orphans without filing a single piece of paper with anyone. The man who came to address this, a county placement agent named Horace Pruitt, arrived on a gray morning in November with a leather satchel of forms and the particular brisk efficiency of a man who has spent his career treating children as a logistics problem to be solved rather than people to be understood. He explained, with the patient condescension of someone repeating a speech he had given many times before, that unaccompanied minors without legal guardians were, under the laws of the state, the responsibility of the county orphan asylum in Portland, that placements there were made according to need and availability rather than family preference, and that it was entirely likely, given the asylum's current overcrowding, that the children would be separated, the boy sent to apprentice on a farm upstate, the girls placed into domestic service in different households, possibly in different towns altogether. He said all of this while seated at Nathaniel's own kitchen table, drinking Nathaniel's own coffee with the flat, unbothered tone of a man stating the weather. "They're not going anywhere," Nathaniel said. Pruitt looked at him with mild, professional patience. "Mr. Cole, with respect, you have no legal standing here. You are not their father, not their relation, not their named guardian under any document. The law does not recognize an attachment, however sincere, as a substitute for legal authority." "Then I'll get the authority," Nathaniel said. Pruitt smiled in the way of a man who has heard this exact promise many times before and watched it dissolve against the machinery of paperwork and deadlines. "That process takes months, Mr. Cole, and requires character references, a hearing before a county judge, and proof of means to support 3 additional dependents on a lighthouse keeper's salary. I have a wagon arriving Thursday. I would encourage you to prepare the children." He stood, gathered his satchel, and left. And Nathaniel stood in his own kitchen with 3 days until Thursday, and the cold understanding that he had absolutely no idea how to fight a system that had clearly swallowed children like this before and would swallow these 3 without slowing down for the effort. He told Oliver that night, because the boy had a right to know, and because Nathaniel had learned in 6 weeks that this particular boy did not do well with surprises sprung on him without warning. Oliver received the news the way he received most hard things, with a stillness that wasn't calm so much as the very controlled lid on something much larger underneath. "I won't let them split us up," he said. "I told you that the first morning. I meant it then, and I mean it now." "I know you did," Nathaniel said, "and I'm telling you the same thing I told you that morning. Nobody is taking your sisters anywhere. I just have 3 days to prove it, and I don't rightly know yet how I'm going to do it, but I am going to do it." Oliver looked at him for a long moment, and something in his face shifted, just slightly. The particular shift of a child deciding, against considerable accumulated evidence to the contrary, to trust an adult with the outcome of something that mattered. "What do you need? Tell me what you need, and I'll help." What Nathaniel needed, it turned out, was the entire town of Saltmarsh Point. And over the next 3 days, he discovered with a kind of stunned humility that he had it. He had spent 15 years keeping his distance from these people, exchanging only the minimum required words, and he had assumed, without ever quite examining the assumption, that this distance meant the town owed him nothing and would offer nothing in return. He was wrong. The harbor merchants he'd traded with for 15 years wrote character letters without being asked twice. The minister, whose church Nathaniel had never once entered, rode out to the point personally to hear the situation, and then rode back to gather 4 more signatures before lunch. Old Captain Henderson, who had known Nathaniel since before Margaret died and had never once pried into his grief, stood up at the county hearing on Thursday morning and told the judge, in a voice that filled the small courtroom, that he had known Nathaniel Cole for 20 years and never known the man to make a promise he didn't keep, and that if Nathaniel Cole said he would raise those 3 children right, the captain would stake his own good name on it. The hearing itself was not long, but it held, for Nathaniel, the entire weight of his life balanced on a single afternoon. Pruitt presented his procedures and his concerns about means and stability. The county judge, a tired, fair-minded man named Abner Coyle, listened to all of it with the patience of someone who had sat through 1,000 hearings exactly like this one, and weighed exactly the things the law required him to weigh. And then, in the moment that Nathaniel would remember for the rest of his life as the one that decided everything, Judge Coyle looked past the lawyers and the letters and asked to hear from the boy directly. Oliver stood in the small courtroom, 11 years old, in a borrowed coat 1 size too large, and he said, "My father always told me, a family isn't the people you're born to, it's the people who show up. Mr. Cole showed up. He didn't have to. He showed up anyway, every single day for 6 weeks, and he never once made us feel like a burden he was carrying. I don't know what the law says about that, but I know what's true." The courtroom was silent. Judge Coyle looked at the boy for a long moment, and then he looked at Nathaniel, and then he picked up his pen.
The guardianship was granted that same afternoon, full and permanent, all 3 children together. No separation, no asylum, no wagon to Portland on Thursday or any other day. Nathaniel signed his name on the paper with a hand that was not entirely steady, and when he stepped outside the courthouse into the cold November light, Oliver was the first to reach him, and then Charlotte, and then Daisy, who simply launched herself into his arms with the complete unself-conscious faith of a small child who had decided, once and for all, where she belonged. The years that followed were not without their hardships, because raising 3 children alone on a lighthouse keeper's modest wage in a drafty cottage on a tidal causeway was never going to be easy. And there were lean winters and worried nights and the ordinary friction of a family learning to be a family. But they built something, the 4 of them, in that cottage and in that light tower that none of them had thought they'd get to have again. Oliver grew into the lighthouse work with a competence that eventually made him Nathaniel's official assistant keeper, a position he held with quiet pride for the rest of his boyhood. Charlotte's gift for numbers carried her, years later, into the harbor master's office, the first woman to hold the post in Saltmarsh Point's history, a fact the whole town treated as an inevitability by the time it happened. And Daisy,
who had once fallen asleep against Nathaniel's side on a cold stone step, grew up never once doubting, not for a single day of her life, that she was wanted exactly as much as any child who had ever been born into a family rather than gathered up out of a shipwreck. On Daisy's 10th birthday, the three children gave Nathaniel a gift they had built themselves, a wooden sign carved by Oliver's increasingly steady hand, lettered by Charlotte's careful precision, painted by Daisy with more enthusiasm than skill. They hung it on the gate at the foot of the causeway, where everyone walking out to the light would see it, and it read simply, "This family was found, not born, and chosen every single day since." Nathaniel stood at that gate for a long time the morning they hung it, and for once in his life he did not try to keep his face.
Arranged the way he usually kept it, because there are some things a man should not have to hide, not from the people who saved him, as surely as he had once saved them. What this story carries beneath its telling is something worth holding on to. Real family is built less by blood than by the daily, deliberate choice to show up for someone, again and again, when it would be easier not to. A single act of courage, the courage of a frightened boy refusing to be moved, can open a door that grief had sealed shut for 15 years. And belonging, the kind that lasts a lifetime, is never something we are simply given. It is something we choose and keep choosing, one ordinary day at a time.